During the lifetime of Charles and Anna Anderson, they left a legacy that was impressive to their contemporaries and is a continuing inspiration and example to their posterity. A small part of that legacy will be discussed here. Let us go back to the year 1908, when Charles Anderson left his family and home in St. John's, Arizona, to return to Sweden as a missionary. At that time, it had been 42 years since he had emigrated from Sweden with his mother, brother, and sister in 1866 at the age of 10. When Charles recorded his missionary experiences in his journal, he said he arrived in Stockholm, Sweden, April 29, 1908. He spent about a week there visiting historic landmarks, museums, statues, institutions, cemeteries, and other points of interest. He mentioned having a long talk with his nephew. On Sunday, he bore his testimony for the first time in the Swedish language. Charles Anderson is the middleman in this picture. He met his mission president, President Sundwall, who assigned him to the Göteborg Conference. He said this assignment was very satisfactory to him as it included his birthplace, and his brother, August, lived in that area. This area is located within the province of Skaraborg in southern Sweden. Two lakes, Lake Vänern and Lake Vättern, border Skaraborg. Charles's ancestors had lived in this area of Sweden over 200 years. On May 6, 1908, a fine day is described by Charles. He said goodbye to the elders in Stockholm and boarded the train for Götene, located in Skaraborg, where he would once again see his brother. As the countryside of this boyhood came into view, many memories must have passed through his mind. The landscape near his home looked somewhat like these pictures taken in the general area. Although it may have seemed like it took forever, Charles arrived. At the railroad station in Götene that same day, it is shown here as it looked in 1958 when Herb Strand visited the area. Here he was met by his brother August, who had not seen him in 25 years. August helped Charles with his bags, and after a short walk, Charles saw August's home and farm in the distance. These pictures of August's home and farm were taken in 1958. Charles described August's place as a nice little home, with a piece of timber and some farming land. This painting of August's home and farm were done about 1924. One would imagine that this place had not changed much from the days Charles was there in 1908 until 1958, when Herb Strand, and August's grandson, visited it. Not far from here, at a place called Hoax, was where Charles and August had lived with their family prior to when Charles, his mother Maria, Klaus, and Hilda left for America. In his journal, Charles described a feeling of homecoming and wrote about visiting Hoax. He said, "August and myself went to the old place where we moved to in 1862 and lived until 1866, May 12th, when we left for Utah. It is called Hoax. We saw the old foundation that the house stood on, the old stone fence. The two old land trees, one on each side of the gate, had been cut down last fall. The wood was still there, so I took a piece with me to Utah." 2 days later, Charles and his brother August traveled about 25 miles south to visit their birthplace. In his journal, Charles called this place Udden. According to a resident of the area, Udden is located in this area of the village today called Lunsbrunn, near Ledschwo. Of course, the old home is not there now, nor was it when Charles and August visited there in 1908. Charles recorded the following in his journal on that day, May 11th, 1908. August and myself went to see the old place Udden, where all of Father's children were born. We found the old well, just the same as it was 50 years ago when my mother warned us children not to fall into it. We also found the foundation of the old house where we lived. The house was gone. We also saw the old oak tree that we took out a swarm of bees and a lot of honey 50 years ago. I found a small dish at the old home. Also, I took a piece of the old oak as a memento. The Anderson family is listed in the clerical survey of Udden in 1860. Note the arrow pointing to Carl or Charles, who was born in 1856. Perhaps Charles and August went to nearby Ledschwo on that May day and saw this Lutheran church. Perhaps some of the Anderson family had attended it. It does not look much different today than it did 100 years ago. During the visit with his brother, Charles remembered how his parents struggled for an existence in Sweden. Charles recorded in his journal his thankfulness that his parents had the courage to join the despised Mormons when they did. The Lutheran Church was the state church in Sweden and had a great influence on the people at the time they lived there. It kept the people under fear and bondage and made it difficult to spread the gospel. Rigid laws gave the people little religious liberty. Missionaries suffered much persecution. Perhaps during his visit with August, Charles recalled how, in 1851, the Mormon elders first preached in Sweden of the Church of Jesus Christ, restored in America by Joseph Smith. It was 4 years later, during the winter of 1855, that Charles' father, Per, and his mother, Maria, first heard of the gospel from the missionaries. During the first part of 1856, 85 people were baptized in Sweden. Charles' father, age 35, and his mother, age 37, were baptized that year in July, the most beautiful and warmest month in Sweden. At that time, the Andersons had 4 children, ranging from John, who was 7, to Charles, who was 6 months. Hilda would be born 3 years later. In his journal, Charles recorded how his parents felt after their baptism. Their only desire was to gather with the saints of God. They were ready to leave the land of their birth, their relatives and friends, and the graves of their ancestors. The only thing that kept them there another 10 years was their financial condition. Yes, from that day on, their desire was to leave for America and Zion, and for that day they began to dream and prepare.
Ye saints who dwell on Britain's shore, prepare yourselves with many more to leave behind your native land, for sure God's judgments are at hand, for some must push and some must pull, as we go marching up the hill, and merrily on our way we go, until we reach the valley of. Pioneer children sing as they walk and walk and walk. For you must cross the raging main before the promised land you gain, and with the faithful make a start to cross the plains with your handcart.
But it would be 10 years after their baptism, and then only with the help of the Perpetual Emigration Fund, would Charles' parents and other members of the church be able to borrow the money to immigrate to America. Even then, Charles' father and his 2 oldest brothers had to stay in Sweden to earn money to immigrate later. This is the Perpetual Emigration Fund note. It is signed by Klaus Anderson. He, his mother Maria, Hilda, and Klaus are listed on it. The journey to America was begun May 12, 1866, by part of the Anderson family. It must have been difficult to leave family and friends that day, realizing that they would never see many of them again. Those who left in the Anderson family were Charles, Mother Maria, who was much older in this picture, his older brother, Nicholas, or Klaus, who was 12 at the time, Hilda, who was 6. This picture was taken when she was 8, and Charles, who was 10, but older when this picture was taken. before leaving Sweden. Their names were recorded with the pastor of the Lutheran Church in Götene. This record showed they immigrated to America. The main reason Charles' parents left Sweden was to join others of their new-found faith. During this period, about one-half of the new converts in Sweden were immigrating to America. Economic reasons were a big consideration for many to leave Sweden. Between 1868 and 1873, over 100,000 Swedes emigrated. Yes, it must have been a memorable experience for Charles to spend a week at the home of August and his family, near where he had lived before leaving Sweden in 1866. Exactly 42 years after Charles left his home the first time, he said goodbye to August and his family and continued on toward Göteborg to begin his mission. On the way he passed through Skara. He simply recorded in his journal, "Then went to Skara, where my grandmother and myself went one day in 1865. We can follow his footsteps through this picture, lighted the same year. Charles also said in his journal, speaking of his grandmother, "I herded her cows one summer when I was 9 years of age." A simple expression, but one of the few Charles included of his childhood. Perhaps 9-year-old Charles and his grandmother were in settings similar to these scenes near Skara, lighted during that time period. Skara is one of the oldest and largest Lutheran churches in Sweden. Today, Skara is a center of secular and religious training. Near Skara, Maria, Charles' mother, was born. She used to dance with the Swedish folk dances and enjoyed the company of young people in her neighborhood. She met her husband-to-be at one of these parties. From Skara, Charles went to Göteborg to begin his mission. The date was May 12, 1908. Perhaps on this day, Charles reflected back to exactly 42 years earlier, May 12, 1866, when he, his mother, his brother Klaus, and his sister Hilda left their home near Götene the first time to begin the long trip to America. Charles' sister, Hilda, was only 6 at that time. She would recall nearly 100 years later what happened after they arrived in Göteborg the first time.
And when we got there, they took us down to a boat. We had to be there at 10 o'clock that night. So we took in the town first of all, and then when it comes to be 10 o'clock, we went down to the boat. And it was a nice big boat with a platform and seats all around and moonlight night. It was real nice. And well, anyhow, when we got down there, we just put two down.
And here was 2 rooms. One was for the people that took care of the boat. And we sat down there so nice and comfortable we didn't want to go up on that deck. We went to sleep there, and in the morning, people were just rolling on that deck sick. So we just looked around a little bit, and then we went down and sit down again. And the woman there came out and picked in on Mother. Oh, she just cussed her. "You're Mormons," she said. "We never have such time, only when the Mormons come through." And Mother never said a word, let her talk. She said, "I hope you go to the bottom when you get in the big ship."
That's where you belong. It was better to take you. And all such languages that she used to Mother there. Mother Janet never heard anyone talk like that before.
They arrived in Copenhagen the next day and stayed there 4 days. At that time, Copenhagen had about 180,000 inhabitants, and it was the first big city they had seen. Charles said it was a beautiful city with many attractions, but they felt lonesome and sad to be separated from their family. In 1866, Copenhagen was where the saints from Denmark and Sweden were traveling en route to Hamburg, Germany, where they would board one of 3 ships chartered by the church for the Scandinavians to cross the ocean. In Copenhagen, the Anderson children made some new friends and enjoyed the companionship of their Mormon children. One of the children here at this time with his family was John Nilsson. Years later, John Nilsson, who was only 7 at that time, would recall that it was in Copenhagen where he first had the pleasure of playing with other Mormon children. He, like many other Mormon children, had been constantly persecuted. As his name was John, children at his school in Denmark would take off their wooden shoes and ask him to fill them with water and baptize them. Maren Rasmussen would recall later how she, then a young lady of 28, waited in Copenhagen to emigrate. She had joined the church 2 years earlier and had been engaged at that time. Her fiancé did not agree with her in religious matters, however, and she left for America alone. She would meet her future husband-to-be while crossing the plains. Charles Warnock recalled later in his life many important events concerning this journey to Utah in 1866. He was 16 at that time. There were 11 in the Warnock family who started for Utah, but only 4 would make it all the way to Utah. The Anderson family very likely knew the Warnocks in Sweden, as they were from the same general area in Sweden. Johanna Wall, who was 46 at that time, was there with her 2 youngest daughters. Her husband and 2 oldest daughters had already gone to Nebraska. They were not members of the church at that time, but 11 years later, part of the family would join the church in Nebraska. Henning Madsen was there, and his wife Karen, and their 4 children. Karen would become ill while crossing the ocean and die shortly before they reached Salt Lake City. These families all came on the Cavour with the Andersons. Many and varied are the stories of those who made this trip to Utah in 1866. After staying in Copenhagen for 4 days, they boarded the ship Aurora, May 28, at 1 in the afternoon. This is an actual picture of that ship. The original is in the Danish Maritime Museum. Their destination was Kiel, Germany, a city of 30,000, in 1866. They arrived at Kiel, Germany at 7:30 a.m. the next morning and left for Hamburg 2½ hours later. Kiel, Germany is point 1 on this map. Following the numbers in sequence, they went to Altona, point 2, Hamburg, point 3, down the Elbe River, point 4, to Cuxhaven, and from there they would cross the ocean. This picture was taken about 10 years previous to their arrival in Hamburg. The customs house is in the foreground. The Andersons could have passed by this building, or even entered into it. They would have walked along the docks of Hamburg. Charles recorded in his journal. In the harbor were a great many ships at anchor. I was very anxious to see the one that was going to carry us across the Atlantic Ocean. A photographer named Hogue lighted up this scene in 1864. One can picture Charles standing on this street, or one very similar to it, on the dock in Hamburg, Germany, wondering which ship would take he and his family across the Atlantic Ocean. Three ships had been chartered by the church that year for the Scandinavian emigration: the Kenilworth, the Humboldt, and the Cavour. The largest one, the Kenilworth, a British ship, would have 684 passengers on board. The Kenilworth left Hamburg about a week before the Cavour. A passenger on this ship, Andrew Jensen, would one day become assistant historian of the church. He recorded the most complete account of the emigration of the Scandinavian saints in 1866. Niels Jensen, his wife Marianne, and their son Christian were on the Kenilworth. On the 5th day out, during a rough part of the voyage over the North Sea, a son was born to the Jensens. At the request of the captain, the baby was christened John Brown Kenilworth, after him. The Humboldt would have 328 Mormon immigrants. It would leave the day after the Cavour, but would arrive in New York 2 weeks before. A picture of the Cavour could not be obtained. It was actually a bark. This picture, the Albert, was also a bark and had about the same tonnage as the Cavour, about 350 tons. The Cavour and the Albert were small ships when compared to the average sailing vessel at that time, which weighed about 1,100 tons, over 3 times as much. So the Cavour was a very small sailing vessel. The manifest of the bark Cavour lists 201 passengers. About 1/3 were Swedes and 2/3 Danes. There were nearly an equal number of men and women. In his journal, Charles recorded, "Finally the boat that was carrying us and our luggage arrived at the side of a large vessel. We ascended a flight of stairs which brought us on deck of the Cavour." This picture lights this scene for us. It depicts German immigrants bound for the United States boarding a steamer in Hamburg. Although the immigrants on the Cavour were Scandinavian, not German, and boarded a much smaller sailing vessel and not a steamer as depicted here, this picture gives more meaning to the experience. They boarded the Cavour on June 30th and stayed there that day and the 31st. A meeting was held on board, as was the custom of all LDS ships, and they were organized into 4 districts. Rules of cleanliness and order were reviewed, and the ship was dedicated by Karl Weiderburg, president of the Scandinavian Mission, and he was a very eloquent speaker. Soon they lifted anchor and were towed down the River Elbe toward Cuxhaven. The immigrants were all well, with the exception of 2 adults and 1 child who had the fever. The weather was clear and pleasant. They were at long last leaving Hamburg on their way to New York. The immigrants were glad finally to be leaving, but they realized they would probably never see their homeland, relatives, or friends again. They were on their way to the new land, to America. In doing research on the voyage of the Cavour, initially very little information was available. But this journal on the crossing of the Cavour was located just before this slideshow was completed the first time in 1984. It provided an almost day-by-day account of the voyage. A series of events occurred at that time which seemed somewhat incredible that allowed this journal to be located. The journal was kept by the clerk of the ship, Magnus Cederstrom. It was in the hands of the descendants of his. Finding it was the most exciting part of the research. The manifest of the Cavour lists Magnus Cederstrom, the clerk, as being 28 at that time. He is much older in this picture. The Cavour took the shortest route through the English Channel instead of the longer route north of Scotland, and went through the Channel June 8, 1866. On June 15th, they entered the Atlantic Ocean. That day there was a light wind. Soon the realities of the voyage began to be realized. These emigrants rode in steerage, where the fare was the lowest. One man on another ship has described steerage the first night, saying that such sickness and groaning he had never witnessed before. He said the closeness of the berths almost suffocated them for want of air. Seasickness was a problem to most immigrants. Hilda said Charles became so seasick he couldn't even eat the sea biscuits. He ate dried peas. Hilda said her brother Klaus found a better solution. He toasted the biscuits in the oven, and they tasted better. Food and water became limited and were of very poor quality. At one point, because of the voyage taking 3 weeks longer than expected, the passengers were allotted 1 quart of water daily per family, instead of the normal 3 quarts for each adult. The death of a loved one was a difficult thing to face. Lars Larsson's son died on June 21st. He was buried the next day. Lars Larsson's wife died 10 days after his son. A total of 4 passengers died while the Cavour was crossing the ocean, and 3 more when they were close to disembarking in New York. A sailor fell overboard after they had been at sea 28 days. Everything possible was done to save him, but all was in vain. They spent the 4th of July conducting a general search for parasites and cleaning. On July 12th, after they had been at sea 42 days, they sighted some fishermen on the banks of Newfoundland. On the voyage, the Cavour went through some stormy weather. A passenger on one ship described what this was like. He said, "One night I remember how the old boat cracked and reeled. We were driven down into the hole and the doors locked. My, how the boat did rock. Tinware jingled and rattled. Sometimes we had to hold onto the bedpost to keep from rolling out of bed on rough nights. Other times the ship was becalmed, and we could go nowhere. It made us feel like getting out and pushing from behind. But during these times, the boredom on ship was counteracted in many different ways. Also, meetings were held where testimonies were born and timely counsel given. After they had been on the voyage 3 weeks, Brother Nelson, the presiding elder, talked to them about being more united in prayer. There were activities to liven up the spirit and strengthen their courage. Discipline and closeness bound them together. There was one marriage on board the ship. The Cavour had many challenges on her voyage across the Atlantic, but she would have one last obstacle course when they entered the 25-mile stretch from the lightship Sandy Hook on the New Jersey coast to the East River piers. This was an obstacle course of shifting shoals and strong currents. A pilot schooner likely came toward the Cavour on Saturday, July 28th. The passengers would have been glad to see this ship, for it would be a sign they were nearing shore. A harbor pilot came on board at 10 o'clock in the morning. The harbor pilot was one of the talented breed of men who knew the channels of the harbor like the veins on the back of their hands. The captain of the ship let him guide the Cavour slowly up the harbor. They had a thunder and lightning storm with rain. They spotted land about 6 hours after the pilot came on board, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This gladdened the hearts of all of them, and many of the women could not hold back the tears. The green shores of Long and Staten Islands were in the distance. Soon they would see the tall steeples and magnificent buildings in the cities of New York and Brooklyn. On Sunday, July 29th, at 4:30 in the afternoon, a physician came on board and because of sickness forbid the ship to go any further. On this day, 26-year-old Hans Hansen died after 5 weeks of illness. 9-month-old Kristen Sanderson died as well. Some of the passengers were ill with the cholera, a highly infectious disease spread by contaminated food and water. 16-year-old Charles Warnick had lost all of his hair. His father had also been very sick and was just a shadow of his former self. The next day, Lars Larsson, whose wife and son had already died on the voyage, would be taken to the hospital with his 2 other sons and a daughter. On Sunday, all the passengers and crew were called together for prayer. Brother Nelson expressed his feelings and thanked God for bringing them across the mighty deep and asked the Lord to bless the captain and all the crew for their love, goodwill, and humanity toward them. He also prayed that the honest in heart in their dear fatherland might understand and accept the gospel. On Monday at 8 o'clock, the inspection committee came on board. The passengers were all registered. At 9 o'clock, Lars Larsen, whose wife and son had already died on the voyage, was taken to the hospital with his 2 sons and a daughter at 4:30 in the afternoon. A tugboat towed them nearer to land. They had entered the bay and proceeded through the Narrows, and were closer to Castle Gardens. A round building, which was used as the immigration depot at the Battery, this map illustrates the route taken over the last 3 days. The line shows the Gedney Channel leading to Sandy Hook on the south, just below the line. Then they enter the area of shifting shoals and strong currents along the line on the main ship channel. As they were nearing the land, they saw New Jersey and Staten Islands on the left and Long Island on the right. Following the line, they entered the Narrows and the Upper Bay, leading to Battery Park. On Tuesday, July 31st at 9:30 in the morning, Thomas Taylor came on board with his secretary, Magnus Cederstrom, turned all the money over to him. Elder Taylor reported later in a telegram sent to Brigham Young that the immigrants on the Cavour were united in their feelings and efforts, and a superior lot of immigrants, which fact, he said, was conceded by outsiders as well as by himself. The immigrants disembarked from the Cavour at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on July 31st, 1866, 61 days after they had left from Hamburg, Germany. They gave a hearty farewell and shouted hurrah from all sides. They were at last on American soil. Immigrants in a new land, a land of freedom and opportunity.